A starving widow offered her wedding ring for bread, but the mountain man took the ring from the shopkeeper and handed it to the widow. Abigail Turner set her wedding ring on the rough wooden counter of the mountain trading post and said she needed flour before the next snowfall. Not credit and not charity, and the steadiness in her voice almost hid the way her hands shook from 2 days without food. The few men gathered near the stove fell quiet, watching the thin gold band catch the weak lamplight, and the trader behind the counter leaned closer as if examining livestock rather than memory. He asked how much flour she expected to buy with something so worn, and when she answered that it had once belonged to a trapper who never came back from the ridge, a murmur moved through the room. The trader named a price that would barely fill half a sack and reached for the ring without looking at her face. Before his fingers touched it, a gloved hand came down flat on the wood and stopped the movement. Silas Boone had entered without noise, snow still clinging to his shoulders, and though he said nothing at first, the trader pulled back instinctively. Silas looked at the ring only once and told the trader the trade would not happen. The trader protested that business did not wait for sentiment, and Silas replied that hunger did not give a man the right to measure grief. Abigail tried to take the ring back herself, unwilling to stand between two men, but Silas picked it up and placed it firmly into her palm as if returning something stolen. The room felt smaller after that. The trader scoffed and asked whether the mountain man planned to feed her all winter, and Silas answered that he planned to prevent foolish bargains. He then set coins on the counter and ordered flour, salt, and dried beans without asking her permission. Abigail stiffened and said she would not take alms, and Silas met her gaze directly for the first time and said she would earn every pound if she chose to follow him up the ridge. The offer was blunt and without comfort, work hauling wood, splitting timber, and tending traps. No softness, no debt. The trader laughed and predicted she would not last a week above timberline, but Abigail folded the flour sack in her arms and told Silas she would work until the coins were repaid. Nothing more and nothing less. Silas nodded once, already turning toward the door. Outside, the sky had begun to close in with gray weight, and the wind carried the warning of deeper snow. As Abigail stepped into the cold behind him, she felt the ring pressing against her skin, no longer lying on a counter, but returned to her hand, and she realized the mountain might prove harsher than hunger. But at least it had not asked her to trade memory for bread. She did not speak during the first mile of the climb, because the mountain had its own rules, and breath mattered more than words. And she knew that if she showed strain too early, Silas Boone would send her back before pride could protest. He did not slow his pace to match hers, yet he did not hurry either, choosing a steady rhythm that forced endurance rather than speed. The flour sack was tied to a small sled he pulled over packed snow, and when the path narrowed into a ridge trail, he handed her the lead rope without comment, testing whether she understood how to guide weight over ice without tipping it into ravine. She adjusted her footing carefully, leaning into the rope at the correct angle, and though her legs trembled, she kept the sled balanced through the first steep descent. Silas watched once, then turned his attention forward again. By midday, the wind sharpened and the trees thinned, leaving only open rock faces crusted with snow, and Abigail felt the altitude pressing against her lungs in a way hunger never had. When they paused near a frozen stream, Silas broke a piece of dried meat in half and offered it without ceremony. She hesitated only a moment before taking it, because refusing now would not restore dignity. It would only waste strength. He told her they would reach the cabin before dark if she did not stop, and she answered that stopping had never kept anyone alive through winter. The path beyond the stream angled sharply across a slope where snow had drifted deep against one side, and Silas tested each step with his boot before committing weight. Abigail followed precisely in his prints, understanding that deviation could mean collapse beneath crusted powder. Halfway across, the sled snagged against a hidden root and tilted toward the drop below. Instinct pulled her forward instead of back, and she braced her shoulder against the wood to keep the load upright while Silas freed the runner. For a moment, the snow beneath her boots shifted dangerously, but she held steady until the sled realigned. Silas did not praise her. He only adjusted the rope and continued upward. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the cabin finally appeared. Low, timbered, and half buried in snow, smoke rising thinly from a stone chimney. Abigail felt relief flicker, but it was not comfort she saw ahead. It was work layered upon work. Silas stopped before the door and said the mountain did not forgive weakness, and if she wished to remain, she would earn heat before rest. Abigail met his gaze without flinching and told him hunger had already tested her worse than cold. As he opened the cabin door, and the first wave of wood smoke met her face, she realized that stepping inside was not refuge but commitment, and turning back now would mean surrendering more than bread. Abigail stepped inside the cabin and did not linger near the hearth, because Silas Boone had already placed the sled runners against the wall and begun stacking wood without removing his gloves, making it clear that arrival did not cancel labor. The cabin was spare. 1 table, 2 bunks, a cast-iron stove, shelves of dried meat and herbs, and nothing suggested comfort beyond what could be maintained by effort. Silas handed her an axe without instruction and pointed toward the woodpile stacked under the lean-to roof outside. Abigail understood immediately that warmth would be earned in full measure, not shared casually. She removed her coat, rolled her sleeves tight despite the cold biting at her wrists, and began splitting kindling into clean, usable lengths instead of hacking blindly at larger logs. Silas paused once to observe her stance and saw that she angled the blade correctly, letting weight fall through grain rather than fighting it. He said nothing, but he moved the heavier logs closer so she would not waste strength dragging them across snow. The wind shifted before dusk, pressing against the cabin walls in low, steady bursts that hinted at gathering weather. Abigail worked until her palms burned and her shoulders trembled, refusing to slow when her stomach knotted from exhaustion. When she finally stepped inside with a final armful of split wood, Silas had already hung a kettle over the stove. He handed her a tin cup of hot water first, not broth, not tea, just heat, and waited to see if she would complain. She drank it without comment. Supper was simple: beans and a thin slice of meat divided evenly between them. She did not ask for more. After eating, she stood and began sweeping the floor near the stove, though he had not requested it. Silas watched the gesture carefully. Not obedience, but contribution. Outside, the wind sharpened into something more aggressive, rattling the shutter on the east wall hard enough to make the cabin creak. Silas stepped out briefly to secure the latch and returned with snow clinging to his coat. He told her the weather would turn before morning, and that anyone unwilling to work through storm should decide before nightfall. Abigail met his gaze and said she had already chosen at the trading post. Silence settled between them, but it was not empty. It was measured. Later, as she prepared her bunk, she noticed the flour sack resting near the table, unguarded. She understood that trust in the mountains did not come through words but through small exposures. The fire burned low as wind rose higher, and Abigail lay awake listening to the pressure building beyond the walls, knowing that winter would not test her patience with kindness, but with force, and that whatever came with the coming storm would demand more than endurance alone. She woke before dawn to the sound of wind grinding snow against the cabin walls like sand against stone, And she did not wait to be told what to do, because she understood that storms rewarded preparation more than reaction. Silas Boone was already pulling on his boots when she stepped from her bunk, and without exchanging greetings, he handed her a coil of rope and told her the trap line below the ridge would be buried if they did not clear it before the drifts hardened. The air outside struck like a blade, sharper than the climb the day before, and the sky had narrowed into a pale gray that promised heavier fall by afternoon. Abigail wrapped the rope across her shoulder and followed Silas along a narrow descent path, half erased by wind. Each step required deliberate pressure to avoid sinking beyond the crust, and when the slope widened near a stand of low pines, she noticed the snow beneath them had formed a smooth, curved surface, unlike the scattered pattern along the ridge. Silas paused briefly and tested the crust with his pole before moving forward, and she marked the hesitation in memory. They worked methodically along the trap line, brushing snow away from the markers and resetting two that had collapsed under weight. The wind rose steadily, carrying loose powder that stung the face and blurred depth, and Abigail felt the slope beneath her boots soften slightly with each shift of weight. As she bent to free a snared branch from the drift, she heard a faint cracking sound, too subtle for someone unfamiliar with mountains to notice. She straightened slowly and looked toward Silas, who had frozen mid-step a few yards above her. The surface beneath them trembled, not violently, but enough to signal movement. Silas gestured sharply for her to angle toward a cluster of exposed rock rather than retrace her path. Abigail moved carefully, planting each foot without haste, because sudden panic would trigger what restraint might still prevent. The cracking deepened into a low, sliding whisper, and a sheet of snow the width of a wagon began to shift downhill in a slow, terrifying glide. Silas lunged forward and caught her arm just as the drift beneath her boots gave way, pulling her toward the rock face as the sliding layer accelerated past them. The snow did not roar. It moved with deadly silence, carrying loose branches and powder into the ravine below. When the motion finally ceased, a portion of the slope they had stood upon lay exposed and jagged, the trapline half buried under fresh debris. Abigail's pulse hammered in her ears, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. Silas released her arm only when he was certain her footing held firm. He said nothing about fear, only that they would take a longer route back to the cabin. As they climbed carefully toward the ridge, Abigail understood that the mountain had just offered its first true warning, and that survival here would depend not on strength alone, but on reading what moved beneath what seemed solid. Abigail did not speak during the climb back to the cabin, because silence felt safer than acknowledging how close the snow had come to taking her. And Silas Boone did not fill that silence with comfort, choosing instead to reroute their path along exposed rock, where the wind had scoured the surface clean. By mid-afternoon, the storm thickened into heavy, blinding fall, erasing tracks behind them and narrowing visibility to a few yards at best. The sled they had left higher on the ridge earlier that morning now needed retrieval before darkness buried it entirely, and Silas made the decision quickly. If the supplies froze beneath fresh drift, they would be without flour before the week ended. Abigail nodded before he finished explaining, because she understood that survival was measured in sacks and rope, not in tension. They climbed toward the ridge shelf where the sled had been anchored near a stand of twisted spruce, and the wind tore at their coats with increasing force. When they reached the shelf, the anchor rope lay half buried, and the sled itself had shifted closer to the edge than before. Abigail dropped to her knees and began digging with her gloved hands while Silas secured the rope around his waist. The slope beneath the sled looked firm at first glance, but the subtle curve of packed snow warned her of weakness beneath the surface. As she cleared the runner, the sled jerked suddenly downhill, dragging the rope taut and pulling Silas forward with it. Instinct overrode thought. Abigail lunged toward the rope and wrapped both hands around it, bracing her boots against a protruding rock as the sled slid toward the ravine. The snow beneath her boots cracked sharply, threatening to break free entirely. For a breathless moment, all three, the sled, Silas, and Abigail, hung in dangerous alignment between motion and collapse. Silas shouted for her to let go, but she tightened her grip instead, shifting her weight backward until the rope bit deep into the rock's edge. The sled slowed just enough for Silas to drive his ice pick into the crust and halt the slide completely. Snow cascaded past them into open space below, vanishing without sound. Abigail's arms trembled violently, but she refused to release the rope until Silas secured the sled properly. When the danger finally settled, neither of them spoke immediately. The wind continued its relentless push, indifferent to what had nearly occurred. Silas looked at her differently then, not as someone he had rescued from hunger, but as someone who had chosen not to release him when told. He cut the rope from his waist and retied it more securely around both of them before guiding the sled back from the edge. As they descended toward the cabin under deepening snowfall, Abigail felt the weight of the mountain shift from threat to shared trial. The physical danger had not only tested endurance, it had altered balance between them. By the time the cabin roof came into view through the storm, she understood that surviving here would no longer be measured by how much she could endure alone, but by whether she would continue choosing to stand firm when the ground itself gave way. She felt the storm close in around the cabin like a wall the moment they barred the door, because the wind did not lessen after the sled incident. It intensified, driving snow hard enough against the timber walls to make the structure groan. Silas Boone secured the shutters without haste, reinforcing each latch as if preparing for siege rather than weather. And when he turned back inside, the room felt smaller than before, not from fear, but from awareness. The mountain had already tested them once that day, and there would be no second attempt at the ridge until the storm passed. Abigail hung her damp gloves near the stove and moved to check the flour sack they had nearly lost, smoothing its surface with deliberate care, because each pound now carried weight beyond hunger. Silas added wood to the fire and set the kettle without speaking. The rhythm between them had shifted subtly. It was no longer employer and worker, nor rescuer and rescued, but something steadier built on shared risk. As darkness fell early under thick cloud cover, the wind struck the chimney hard enough to send sparks briefly down the flue, and Abigail reacted first, adjusting the draft to prevent smoke from filling the room. Silas noticed the quick movement and gave a small nod, the closest he had come to acknowledgement since the sled halted at the ravine. Supper was quieter than before, but not tense. The storm outside demanded focus, rather than conversation. After they finished eating, a sudden crack echoed above the cabin roof, followed by a heavy thud that shook loose snow down the wall. Abigail stood instantly, scanning for damage. Silas stepped outside, despite the wind, to inspect the eaves, returning moments later to report that a snow shelf from the higher slope had broken loose and struck the cabin wall, missing the chimney by inches. The warning was clear. Even shelter here was conditional. Abigail did not ask whether she should return to town once the storm cleared. Instead, she asked where the spare roof beams were kept. Silas directed her toward a small loft where additional supports had been stored precisely for such incidents. Together they braced the weakened side before the next drift could accumulate, working in coordinated silence while wind howled beyond the door. When at last they sat near the fire again, exhaustion settled deeper than cold had earlier. Silas broke the quiet first, stating that most people who come to the mountain leave after the first true scare. Abigail answered that hunger had already taught her what leaving accomplished. The firelight reflected faintly off the ring still resting on her finger, and Silas's gaze lingered on it briefly before he looked away. The storm raged long into the night, yet inside the cabin something steadier held. An understanding that survival here required more than endurance. It required trust measured in action. As Abigail lay awake, listening to wind batter the walls, she realized that the mountain had tested not only her strength, but her decision to remain. And for the first time since the trading post, she felt that staying might not be desperation, but choice. Abigail stepped outside at first light, expecting only drifts and broken branches. But what she saw below the ridge tightened something in her chest that the avalanche never had. The storm had passed, leaving the world stripped clean, yet a single line of tracks cut across the open clearing beneath the cabin, fresh, deliberate, and not made by either of them. Silas Boone came to the doorway behind her and followed her gaze without speaking. The tracks had not approached from the main trail. They had come from the lower timber line where no trapper passed in winter, unless driven by purpose. Abigail moved downhill carefully, tracing the line with her eyes before her boots disturbed it. Halfway across the clearing, the tracks stopped near the woodpile, then circled once around the cabin before turning back toward the trees. There were no attempts to force entry, no broken latch, only a statement of presence. Silas crouched to study the boot impressions, noting the wide heel and uneven pressure of someone carrying weight. He said quietly that no one in this range wandered casually during a storm. Abigail felt anger rather than fear. Whoever had come had known they would be inside and vulnerable. As they circled the cabin, she noticed something tied to the lower rung of the sled frame, a strip of cloth, dark and knotted tight. She pulled it free and unfolded it to reveal a scrap torn from a flour sack with a short line scratched into it. "Winter takes what it wants." The message was not signed. It did not need to be. Silas's jaw hardened slightly, though his voice remained level as he explained that another mountain man named Harlan Creed had once claimed hunting rights along this ridge and had never accepted that Silas built here without asking permission. Abigail asked why he had not mentioned that before. Silas answered that conflict on the mountain was usually settled by distance, not confrontation. Abigail studied the tree line where the tracks vanished and said distance had just ended. Instead of retreating into the cabin, she walked the perimeter and marked every angle where approach would be visible. Silas watched her movements closely and did not stop her. By midday, he had reset his rifle above the doorframe, not as threat but as precaution, and reinforced the sled harness inside rather than leaving it exposed. Abigail returned to the stove and began sorting dried goods with sharper focus than before, because if someone intended to pressure them off the ridge, supplies would be the first target. That evening, as shadows lengthened across untouched snow, Abigail did not ask whether Harlan would return. She asked when. Silas answered that men who leave messages rarely leave satisfied. As darkness settled, both of them understood that the mountain had shifted again. Not through storm or snow this time, but through intention. And that the next challenge would not come from nature, but from a man who believed the ridge belonged to him. She did not wait inside the cabin the next morning, because waiting felt like surrender. And when the sound of boots crunching over crusted snow carried across the clearing, she was already standing near the woodpile with the axe balanced loosely in her grip. Silas Boone stepped out behind her without rushing, his rifle visible but lowered, and together they watched a broad-shouldered man emerge from the timber line as if he owned the path he walked. Harlan Creed did not look like a drifter. He moved with the slow confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He stopped halfway across the clearing, studying the cabin with open appraisal before shifting his gaze to Abigail. He spoke first, saying the ridge had long-standing boundaries and that newcomers rarely survived winters without assistance. Abigail understood the implication clearly. Protection in exchange for compliance, Silas answered that the ridge had no written claims, and that trade routes did not grant ownership. Harlan's expression sharpened slightly at the refusal. He gestured toward the sled and asked whether supplies were running thin after the storm, suggesting he could arrange deliveries for a price. Abigail stepped forward before Silas could respond and said they managed what they needed without interference. Harlan's eyes narrowed, measuring her presence rather than dismissing it, and he noted the ring still resting on her finger, asking quietly whether she planned to remain long enough to justify such stubbornness. The remark was deliberate, meant to test her resolve. Abigail did not look away. She replied that hunger had already tested her more thoroughly than any ridge ever could. Harlan shifted tactics then, stating that he would be setting traps closer to the cabin from now on, and that lines sometimes crossed without warning. The threat was indirect, but unmistakable. Silas moved one step forward, enough to signal boundary without escalating further. He said calmly that any trap within sight of the cabin would be cut free. Silence stretched tight between the three of them, broken only by wind dragging loose snow across the clearing. Harlan studied their posture carefully, likely calculating whether intimidation would produce fracture. It did not. After a long pause, he turned without another word and retraced his path toward the timberline. Abigail did not relax immediately. She watched until he vanished among trees. Only then did she exhale slowly. Silas lowered the rifle and said that men like Harlan preferred leverage to confrontation, meaning something more subtle would follow. Abigail nodded and began gathering wood again, though her focus had sharpened further. The ridge was no longer contested by weather alone. As dusk approached, Abigail inspected the trap markers and sled harness personally, searching for tampering. She found none, but that absence unsettled her more than damage would have. Harlan had shown himself openly once. The next move would likely come unseen. And as night settled over the ridge, Abigail understood that standing firm would now require more than survival. It would require strategy. She did not wait inside the cabin the next morning, because waiting felt like surrender. And when the sound of boots crunching over crusted snow carried across the clearing, she was already standing near the woodpile with the axe balanced loosely in her grip. Silas Boone stepped out behind her without rushing, his rifle visible but lowered, and together they watched a broad-shouldered man emerge from the timberline as if he owned the path he walked. Harlan Creed did not look like a drifter. He moved with the slow confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He stopped halfway across the clearing, studying the cabin with open appraisal before shifting his gaze to Abigail. He spoke first, saying the ridge had long-standing boundaries and that newcomers rarely survived winters without assistance. Abigail understood the implication clearly. Protection in exchange for compliance. Silas answered that the ridge had no written claims, and that trade routes did not grant ownership. Harlan's expression sharpened slightly at the refusal. He gestured toward the sled and asked whether supplies were running thin after the storm, suggesting he could arrange deliveries for a price. Abigail stepped forward before Silas could respond and said they managed what they needed without interference. Harlan's eyes narrowed, measuring her presence rather than dismissing it, and he noted the ring still resting on her finger, asking quietly whether she planned to remain long enough to justify such stubbornness. The remark was deliberate, meant to test her resolve. Abigail did not look away. She replied that hunger had already tested her more thoroughly than any ridge ever could. Harlan shifted tactics then, stating that he would be setting traps closer to the cabin from now on, and that lines sometimes crossed without warning. The threat was indirect, but unmistakable. Silas moved one step forward, enough to signal boundary without escalating further. He said calmly that any trap within sight of the cabin would be cut free. Silence stretched tight between the three of them, broken only by wind dragging loose snow across the clearing. Harlan studied their posture carefully, likely calculating whether intimidation would produce fracture. It did not. After a long pause, he turned without another word and retraced his path toward the timberline. Abigail did not relax immediately. She watched until he vanished among trees. Only then did she exhale slowly. Silas lowered the rifle and said that men like Harlan preferred leverage to confrontation, meaning something more subtle would follow. Abigail nodded and began gathering wood again, though her focus had sharpened further. The ridge was no longer contested by weather alone. As dusk approached, Abigail inspected the trap markers and sled harness personally, searching for tampering. She found none, but that absence unsettled her more than damage would have. Harlan had shown himself openly once. The next move would likely come unseen. And as night settled over the ridge, Abigail understood that standing firm would now require more than survival. It would require strategy. She did not expect Harlan Creed to return after the snare incident. Yet she kept watch for 3 full days, because confidence on the mountain came from vigilance, not assumption. When no new tracks appeared near the cabin or trap line, she understood that the message had finally been delivered without violence. The ridge did not belong to the loudest man. It belonged to whoever held it through winter. Silas Boone resumed routine work without comment, but his glances towards the lower slope carried quiet approval rather than concern. On the 4th morning, Abigail stepped outside before sunrise and studied the clearing with a sense she had not felt since leaving town. Ownership. Not through claim papers or argument, but through endurance and choice. She turned back toward the cabin and found Silas repairing the sled harness she had adjusted days earlier. He did not look up immediately when he spoke. He said that when she first walked into the trading post with that ring in her hand, he had believed he was buying tools, not trouble. Abigail answered that she had believed she was trading memory for bread. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but measured. Silas set the harness aside and finally faced her fully. He told her that most people who come to the ridge come to escape something, but few stay because they want to build something. He paused, searching for words more carefully than he ever had during storm or confrontation. Then he said plainly that she had proven she belonged here, not because he allowed it, but because she chose it when she could have left. He stepped closer and added that the cabin had space for one more decision, whether she intended to remain beyond this winter as partner rather than guest. Abigail did not answer immediately. Instead, she removed the wedding ring from her finger and held it between them, not as surrender of memory, but acknowledgement of its place in the past. She said that she would not trade one survival for another unless it was chosen freely. Silas nodded once and replied that he did not offer rescue. He offered equal ground. That was enough. Weeks later, when the first break of early thaw softened the lower ridge, they traveled together to the small mountain chapel used by trappers passing through in spring. There were no crowds, no spectacle, only 2 witnesses from neighboring cabins and a minister who valued brevity over ceremony. Abigail wore a simple wool dress and kept the old ring sewn into her coat pocket rather than on her hand. When vows were spoken, they were direct and unembellished, promising work shared rather than protection granted. Afterward, they returned to the ridge not as mountain man and widow, but as partners who had tested winter and each other. As the cabin came into view against melting snowbanks, Abigail understood fully that she had not been saved by a mountain man who refused her ring. She had been met by one who recognized that survival meant standing beside, not over. And this time, she had chosen where she belonged. If you were Abigail, would you have sold the ring or climbed the mountain? Tell me below. What would you have done? And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe Native American Tales for more stories.